Okay, East Asia. We're going to spend a little more time on this because it's an area that I'm spent a fair amount of time working with. Um, so what you got in front of you is basically the image of East Asia. We intentionally segregate that from Southeast Asia. And that has to do more with actually sort of history, but also the physical aspects, but also the history of the region. The 800-pound gorilla in East Asia is China. And this isn't recent. China has been the huge dominant force in Asia for thousands of years, maybe even back as far as 5, 6, 7,000 years, these parts of China. And in part, there's also a huge difference with the areas we've seen before. If you think of Western Europe, basically movement back and forth was quite easy for most of that region, with a few exceptions, maybe Switzerland. And when we moved to West Asia, you had the Mediterranean. So again, there was access pretty much through a lot of the region. Moved to South Asia, it was a little more restricted. Of course, you got the Himalayas. But the key here is there's a lot of movement between regions. Well, yeah, not quite so much with India, but there's still some. When we switch over here to the landform view, now when we look at this part of the world, there's a huge distinctive difference that if you don't understand is why you would never understand how China thinks of the world around it. When we look at China, basically from this area here over to here, we're looking at an area that basically is surrounded by incredibly hostile terrain to people. To the south, you've got the mountain ranges over here, and then you've got that turns into the Himalayas here. So this separates China to the areas to the south. It's very difficult to get across that way. To the west, you've got the spectacular Taklamakan Desert. That's this area here. One of the world's 2 or 3 most harsh terrains. It gets up to 120 something in the summer in the daytime. You literally can cook eggs on rocks here. To the north, what you've got is again mountains and more desert to the northwest. And when you get to the north here, shared with Mongolia, you've got your steppe regions, but you've also got some sort of really massive mountains. When you look at this region, they're sort of hard to show up here. But the key here is that when you think about them, if we contrast the mountains in the way that we see them, for example, in North America, you go from the east to the west and you go and you hit the Mississippi, and then you hit the Rocky Mountains, you go up over the mountains, and then boom, you're back down. If you notice with this, and this is really true when you fly over this region, is what you've got here almost looks like a corrugated sheet, an aluminum sheet. You've got one mountain range, another mountain range, another mountain range, another mountain range. And this is pretty much the pattern all through the northern region that China has with the areas to the east. They aren't single mountain ranges, they're just stacks of mountains, like someone using them to store mountains. And what this means is incredibly difficult to get through, because once you get through one mountain, you don't end up on the other side, you just end up with another mountain. So what this means is to the north also, especially true, for example, north of Beijing here, you end up with just an incredibly convoluted landscape, which means it's very difficult to gain access, from the north, Mongolia, Siberia, into China, vice versa. So basically, you look at China, what you've got is you've got a fence, sort of a physical fence. You've got mountains to the north, mountains to the northwest, deserts to the west, mountains to the southwest, and mountains to the south. Your only open section is, of course, the China Sea, the Pacific Ocean. And given the location of that vis-a-vis storms, that's not particularly safe either. This is not a protected area. Think of the number of hurricanes and cyclones that come blowing through here every year. So what you end up with is, one big factor is then the concept of China, to a lesser extent the areas around it, is almost like it's in a box. It's in a natural box surrounded on 3 sides, and with a 4th being ocean. And within the box, access is incredibly easy. And the reason is very simply these mountains and stuff to basically the other 3 sides are also some of the largest water catchments in the world. Snow falls, rain falls, it gets on these mountains, and then it comes down this way. And basically the whole eastern part of China, all the way from here in Hebei down to Guangdong province in the south, all of this is basically floodplains. This is all just river flats. You have these enormous river systems that run through China. The Yellow or Honghe in the north, and the Yangtze in the south. There are 2 of the biggest ones that basically drain all these enormous ranges of mountains to the west, north, and south, and push it all through here. And you can sort of see this if you look at this whole section here. This is all part of the Yellow River Plain. So your average elevation all the way from just east of Zhengzhou, all the way to Shanghai or Qingdao, is basically about 15 to 20 feet. There's occasional mountains or hills, but you look at the rest of it, the bugger is just totally flat because it's all basically mud that was brought down by the river and just filled up this whole area. China actually grows, I can never remember the numbers, it's less now because of the dams in the south, but at least in the Long Hood in the north, China grows by, I think it's something like 10 to 30 feet a year, every year, just from the new mud that the river pushes out. All this, mud taken from the land way back up in the mountains in the west, and what we would think was Nepal, Tibet, etc., brought down and it eventually ends up here. And so what you've got is China is basically ruled by rivers. In this regard, it's sort of like Western Europe, in the sense that rivers are central. But in China, rivers are everything. Rivers flood in the summer or in the spring, and they flood everything. But they also bring soil. So in this regard, it's very much like Egypt and the Nile. But it's even more spectacular because, for example, here, what happened about, I think it's about 500 years ago, is the Yellow River comes up through here. And what happened is they were actually digging a series of irrigation canals, weren't paying very much. They screwed up a little bit engineering wise. And so the river came up here, got into the canals, completely changed course and moved up in a new direction. And the end result is estimated, who knows how many millions of Chinese died. Whole cities literally ended up without water overnight because all of a sudden the river changed course and moved north 150 miles. Then it moved south again. And so what you get is this system, because the river, here's the river here, because the river basically made this floodplain, it can go anywhere it wants to in the floodplain. If you want to use that in a local analogy, visualize standing on anywhere in Kapahulu pretty much, especially if you're Kapahulu down towards, down on Kapilani Boulevard, and you look towards Waikiki, say from anywhere from the golf course down there. That's all the floodplain of the Pololo Manoa streams. And so everything there is only about, 10 feet above sea level because it's all just mud that was brought down by the streams. That's a miniature version of what you see here with basically all of Eastern China. All of Eastern China is basically given to it, if you would, by the rivers. And so China is entirely dependent on its rivers. It gets a fair amount of rain, but the rivers bring down the soils. The rivers allow you to do irrigation. And so what you end up with, some of the richest agricultural land on the planet is in China, but it's entirely dependent on these rivers. So in that regard, they're better off than, say, West Asia, where you've got rivers, but you don't have, the soils and the other advantages. Here you've got a lot more persistent rivers, but they can bring their own set of problems. And just as a note, this is why the Huang He is called the Yellow River, because it literally is brown all the time. That's from the dirt in. If you go and take a cup of water, I tried this once, you go and take a cup of water and you'll find the bottom, maybe 10, 15 centimeters is actually just mud. So, it's one of the muddiest rivers in the world outside of, I think the Amazon's pretty close. So just even today, you've got huge amounts of material being brought down that then ends up being new land, if you would think of it, down in this particular area to the east. So China is a very, very rich agricultural region just because of Mother Nature. And what this means is human populations settle here really, really, really early. We have the oldest humanoid skeletons or remains in the world outside of Africa are actually found in this part of China, Shanxi and Henan, parts of China. And they date back millions of years. So you've got, and it's not that was the next place people went to, but it was by far one of the best places that people went to. And it's very likely that China was this section of China was one of the first places that human populations actually developed and evolved. We have Chinese towns and cities starting up, over 10,000 years ago, which is earlier, or even earlier than you see in West Asia, which is oftentimes called the quote, cradle of civilization, unquote. But it's not, it's just one of several, and China is one of the other major ones. Now, what this means is because it's so useful for human settlement, especially once planting, agriculture starts, is very quickly huge parts of China not only end up with people farming, but you end up with huge populations in China very, very, very early on. This is the huge difference with West Asia. You have agriculture starting up at the same time in West Asia, specifically what's usually called the Middle East. But it really isn't, except for the exception of maybe Egypt and the Nile, it's not really a very dense population. In the case of the Nile, it's literally within, 10 miles of either side of the river. In China, it's basically this whole huge section of China becomes this enormous population much earlier than any place else on the planet. And what this means, among other things, is your populations in areas surrounding it Korea, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Taiwan / Formosa. All this region is basically, revolves, if you would, around this enormous Chinese population, which of course is also political, military, everything for thousands of years. What you also get is because of this density of population and the conditions that are there, and the fact that China has a fair amount of resources, is like Western Europe, you end up with a fair amount of technological innovation early on. So you find that, for example, bronze is either invented in China or northern Thailand / Laos, China, probably before it's actually invented in West Asia. In fact, there's an argument that it might have moved to West Asia. So what you have is metallurgy starts up in this part of the world, and then quickly gets exported out to what's now the Koreas, and eventually ends up in places like Japan. So when you end up in this part of the world, and this includes Southeast Asia, what you see is almost the center of everything that happens here in China, and then moves out to these surrounding regions. It has nothing to do with Europe. So basically, the European world pretty much stops, at the edges of the Mediterranean. And what you find as a center of gravity for most of this region is China. India becomes sort of the polar opposite, or the balance, if you would, to the south. And these become your great sort of global players for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, is what's going on here and what's going on here. They both have huge populations. They've got rich resources. They've got massive riverine systems and access to stuff. And the end result is they don't compete with each other, ironically, because you've got this enormous fence that separates them. But with their own sphere of influence, in the case of India, this whole region here, in the case of China, it'd be Southeast Asia and all this area to the east, pretty much become their playing field, if you would. And so the physical geography of China is important not only for China, but also the regions around them. And probably the classic dynamic would be the Chinese and the folks to the north, the pastoral populations in what are called Mongolia and Manchuria, which are largely herding populations, fairly, and that would also include these areas to the west, Uzbekistan, et cetera now. These are all largely pastoral areas with, herd animals and fairly small populations moving around the landscape in these steppe regions, because that's pretty much all you can do. They don't have the riverine resources. They don't have the richness. But what happens is, since they're highly mobile and they're pretty aggressive, the idea of coming down and taking over China, raiding this area because it's so rich, becomes a dynamic that's been in play for at least 4,000 or 5,000 years, of folks from this area coming down and basically trying to take what they can get from these large settled populations in the south. 4,000, 5,000 years ago, these were called the Xiongnu. In a later period, this becomes the Mongolians, who come and take over China several times. Of course, back in 1600, 1600, this becomes the Manchurians, who come over and rule China till 1911 as the Qing dynasty. So what you get is the richness of China makes it attractive in a really bad way. It's sort of like having a very nice house without locked doors. But what does save China from even more trouble is the fact that, again, you've got these actual physical barriers, which make it very difficult to come from Mongolia to China, even more so from here to China. Crossing the desert regions, something like the Taklamakan, good luck on that one. And again, as I mentioned last time, I think it was, is remember that this particular area here is the area where the rivers end up changing directions when you have with vertical land shifts here along the north side of the Himalayas. So this is a whole region that just, you can just look at this landscape, and that's not an area you're going to go cruising through in a Jeep. So in this world, again, basically acts as a barrier to gain access to this world. So when you're looking at East Asia, China is the player, and that's not recent. Current political situations are just a reflection of literally thousands and thousands of years of history. Now, one of the side effects is when you're looking at the folks over here on the Korean Peninsula, Koreans, you're looking at Japanese, etc. What you find is a huge part of what makes them who they are is stuff that they've brought in from China. Modern Japanese kimonos, for example, they're basically a modified version of dress that was popular in the courts in China back in 700 AD during the Tang Dynasty. Same is true of a lot of Korean formal wear. It's basically, again, Tang Dynasty wear that was from the 700s. So what you find is a huge part of what makes Koreans who they are and how they see the world, makes Japanese who they are and how they see the world, come from this. And they're pretty open to that. I mean, there's a general sense in Asia that China is like the sort of great founder of a lot of what's going on in the rest of the world. Doesn't mean they like them, but it does mean they're very aware of the fact that China ends up as sort of being the source of a lot of stuff. Now, of course, this has huge implications if you go back to, if you remember when we were talking about Europe, with the idea that the past drives the present. What this means is if you're China's government, one, you always see yourself as inheriting thousands of years of tradition of control for your own area, but you also see yourself as being like the great father that basically tells everyone else in the region what to do. And when you say hop, everyone, in the area around you is supposed to hop because you're the big player. You're the 800-pound gorilla. And so when you look at current Chinese policy under Xi Jinping, for example, it's with you have to understand that they don't see themselves as new players. Yeah, they're the Chinese Communist Party and they've only been in power since 1949, but they see themselves as just the newest, the Mark V version of the Chinese Empire. And among other things, what that means, well, all of a sudden someone like the United States and the Europeans say, well, you should do things this way. These guys are sort of looking around saying, well, we've been a world power for 5,000 years. Who are you talking to, Kemosabe? Why should we listen to you? And that's not right, but it's sort of understandable if you understand the mindset. What it also means, if you're the countries around China, you tend to have this very complex relationship. On one hand, China, to a certain extent, gave you what you are, but also it's, of course, again, it's the 800-pound gorilla. So you don't want to like banging around your backyard or something like that. So this very complex relationship that China has with the world around it, but also, at least to the Chinese, the fact that they really traditionally, and much of Chinese history, have been totally disinterested in the world outside of this sort of Chinese area because it was surrounded by mountains, it was hard to access. Someone like Marco Polo comes wandering across here and comes into China. They find him interesting, but you don't see a lot of Chinese then going the other direction to go check out what the Europeans were up to. Their attitude was they had everything they needed. This is why China's traditionally been called the Middle Kingdom, in the sense they saw themselves as the middle of the sort of civilized world. And the barriers tend to reinforce that real parochial attitude. And it's also why, even though they've been a major power for thousands of years, you don't see China usually colonially expanding outside of its major bounding areas. You don't see Chinese expeditions trying to take over Europe. You don't see Chinese expeditions trying to take over, India or, anything that looks like the European expansion of the colonial period. Just because the Chinese weren't, to be honest, just that interested. And even today, China's really not all that interested in what happens outside of what it considers its area of influence. And this makes it really different. And it's, if you just think back for a little while, this is one reason why they have a very uncomfortable relationship with Russia, whether it be Imperial Russia, the USSR, modern Russia. Xi Jinping and Putin might get along temporarily, but I can guarantee if they go into a room, everyone gets checked for sharp objects because they have absolutely no love lost with Russia, because they see Russia as the great expander. Of course, they share borders with China. So if China is vaguely paranoid about everything else, they've got a huge load of paranoia about Russia and what Russia's up to. And Russia, well, who knows what Russia's doing. So when you're looking at that whole issue of China, you have to realize that they have a different mindset about the world around them than anything we've seen so far. Everyone we've seen so far, maybe to a lesser extent with India, but all the other regions so far, have all sort of seen themselves in an order, in a system that's related to each other. India, even to a certain extent, that way because of colonialism. But you have to remember, China does not end up as being part of a colonial power. Parts of China do, but the vast majority of China ends up being, quote, independent in a sort of way, right down to the present. So they don't have a period of time in which someone else can actually gunpoint tell them what to do all the time, and that makes their view of the world very different from the folks that we've seen so far. Especially, that's probably the huge difference between them and India, is the lack of explicit colonization.